Now, this evening's talk, if we were being professional and proper, could be described as being about how we try to interpret even significant monuments from the past, how we propose hypotheses and test them, and the discipline moves on through this process of testing and retesting and changing of ideas. Alternatively, we could describe this evening's talk as never letting a lack of evidence get in the way of a good story. So, what I want to do is to introduce you first of all to some of the problems, some of the challenges that we've faced when looking at what can be very, very obvious monuments in the landscape. There are difficulties, and yes, some amazing stories have been attached to these various structures at different times. So I want to start off outside the National Park or the Yorkshire Dales, but I want to end up coming in to the Dales area and looking a bit more closely at two areas in particular, and leaving you with a whole host of imponderable questions and not a single answer among them, as is my wont. But lots to think about. And I think, as with so many of the talks that I've been giving in these last couple of years, the arrival of freely available LiDAR data has made a tremendous difference to looking at field monuments, and particularly these large, extensive earthworks that often run for many miles across the countryside. So I want to bring in how this LiDAR data is helping us to reassess some of the grand stories that have been told in the past about these monuments and these structures. So let's start with the famous ones then, just to get our minds in gear and to get thinking about some of the interpretations. Hadrian's Wall on the left, with the complex system of earthworks and ditches, in addition to the stone-built structures and the sadly deceased sycamore tree. And on the right of the screen, the Antonine Wall further north. Great long, linear, frontier boundaries, intimately tied up with the Roman military. Lots of evidence, lots of finds from the forts and the structures along the way. So, there's an awful lot that we can say with a great deal of confidence about those structures. There are other structures, other sites, which are perhaps a little more shrouded in mystery. Offers Dyke has historical records relevant to it, but the Wands Dyke in Wiltshire, no direct dating evidence, and not that I'm aware of. Its dating interpreted mainly on the basis of the name, Woden's Dyke, coming from Anglo-Saxon. If the Anglo-Saxons were calling it Woden's Dyke, it must have been there when they arrived, so it must be older than them. There are occasional historical insights, such as we get from Taliesin. If there's an enemy on the dyke, Urien, the king of Reged, up to the northwest of us, will strike him down. So there's a continuation in these monuments, which can be reasonably interpreted as early medieval. There's a continuation of this idea of defensive structures, fortifications, things that are built as a frontier, but also a boundary against attack, against an aggressor. Looking at how these dike systems work, if we have a look at this site of Stanwick, which is a late Iron Age into the very beginning of the Roman period fortification to the northeast of us, it demonstrates, in that picture top left, Mortimer Wheeler's Hollywood-style reconstruction. It demonstrates how these defensive structures work. You have a big ditch, and then you have a rampart. Now, as I say, there's a bit of hyperbole in that reconstruction, which we won't go into here, but excavating that site in 1954, Sir Mortimer Wheeler wove it into the historical accounts of the Roman campaigns in the north of England, to the extent that he described the Iron Age Celtic Brigantian warriors who were digging out that ditch in the solid bedrock, lifting their heads to see the Roman legions appearing over the skyline and abandoning half-quarried lumps of rock to dash up to man the ramparts. Now, if you look at the plan of the whole site on the right there, this is such a huge site, such an extensive area, length of earthworks. There just wasn't the population locally to defend that entire circuit of ramparts. And it is a circuit because it encloses an area. The ditches are always on the outside of the ramparts, facing the enemy, coming at them. But is it really a defensive fortification in that sense, enclosing as it does such a huge area? So the technical term that's been applied to this site is one of a group of very large late Iron Age enclosures. All the others are in the south of England. This is the only example in the north, and it's referred to as a territorial oppidum. And that is an oppidum, one of these fortifications that were encountered by the Romans. It's a term borrowed from Julius Caesar, but it's enclosing a territory. It's not like a hill fort, which is defending a nice little hilltop settlement. It's enclosing a huge area. So we have this idea that these things work by putting the ditch on the enemy side of the bank. So it's adding to the obstacle that they have to cross before they even get to the rampart with people hurling obnoxious substances down at them. And so if we move further down the A1, further down south, down the A1 to Aberford, just to the east of Leeds, there's a whole series of earthworks there, well-known series of earthworks, the Aberford Dykes. They've been known about for many, many decades, and they're quite obvious structures in the landscape. And Grim's Ditch, running north-south, has the ditch on the east side of the rampart. And this implies that it's built against an enemy coming from the east. Being a north-south line, that has been equated with the boundary of the kingdom of Elmet, the early medieval kingdom of Elmet. If we look at that shaded area where the other Aberford Dykes congregate, right next to and across the A1, that's Becker Banks and the South Dyke and the Rains and the Ridge. They are, as I say, significant features in an area that has seen a lot of development work and a lot of destruction going on. So there has been some archaeological work in and around these particular fortifications. Now, to get a better view of these, we can go to the LiDAR image of that same area. And this strips away the buildings, it strips away the trees, and you can just see the surface of the ground. Now, in places, some of these banks have been built over. In places, they've been ploughed flat. But this network of banks has rather a complex layout, which in some respects defies explanation. So the grand story is that Becker Banks, this is from a paper published several decades ago, the Becker Banks represent the last stand of the Brigantes against the advancing Roman armies. It's Sir Mortimer Wheeler, but shifted a few miles south. The ditch is on the south side of that bank, which runs along the northern side of the Cockbeck. It's emphasising a natural barrier, it's reinforcing a natural barrier. The Rains, slightly more complicated in that uses the cockbeck as perhaps one side of a defence, but the rains start out from cockbeck and then run up a slope across the contour. And it's not immediately clear to weave that line into any particularly grand story. If the Romans were coming up that way, they were coming up the A1. They weren't heading off at a side. And the Rains earthwork cuts across the south bank, and unfortunately, the ditch of the south bank is on the northern side. So if we follow that interpretation, that explanation of the ditch being on the side of the enemy, then the south bank was not built by the Brigantes against the Romans, and it certainly wasn't built by the Romans against the Brigantes, so it must have been built by somebody else. So the work that has gone on there has produced some dating evidence, and this is one of the big challenges. You've got these earthworks, which, as I say, you can have banks the height of that doorway or even higher. You can have deep ditches, as you can see on the excavation photograph top left. And you've got these things running for kilometres across the grid. There may be no dating evidence whatsoever for mile after mile after mile after mile of these things. Or you may strike lucky and you may find some datable material in a particular section that's being investigated. There's no way in which anyone could undertake an archaeological investigation along the whole length of one of these things. So, as you can see there, Becker banks were constructed early in the first millennium BC. They're early Iron Age, perhaps early to mid-Iron Age in date. Nothing to do with the Romans initially. But of course, these are substantial and significant structures. And once built, they have altered the earth, to use Richard Bradley's wonderful phrase. And they do leave this big, obvious feature in the landscape, which is there for subsequent generations to use and reuse as often as they wish. So there are recuts in the top of the ditch, and in the silting of those recuts, there's Roman pottery. So that gives us some kind of indication that maybe the Becker banks were actually reinstated against some sort of attack from the south. I should point out at this stage, of course, that the main line of Roman advance was not at the A1, it was from Lincoln up to Brough, Petuaria, and towards York. So that aside, we still really don't have an adequate explanation for the south bank facing against an enemy coming from the north. And the dating evidence there puts that at the end of the Iron Age, again, before any potential conflict with the Romans. But interestingly, it does overlie what looks to be perhaps an earlier alignment of pits. Certainly a few earlier pits were found in the section excavated. How far that line extends is unknown. But potentially these boundaries could, in this area, have quite early beginnings, which is not surprising. That shouldn't surprise us at all, because in other parts of the country, we can see people in the Bronze Age constructing huge and complex linear earthworks. So it shouldn't surprise us that they have early Iron Age or even Bronze Age origins and have then been reused. Becker banks ends up defining the boundaries of a medieval township, a parish, and a wapentake. Once these things are there, if they're in the right place, if they're marking the right lines, they will get used for thousands of years. So, taking all of that combined critique on board as to how we might look at these earthworks and begin to explain them, I want to look at these two areas in the Yorkshire Dales. The Grinton-Fremington Dykes in Swaledale and Tor Dyke above Kettlewell at the top end of Wharfdale. The Grinton-Fremington Dykes are substantial features in the landscape. This one topped by a modern stone wall. I say modern, it's only a few hundred years old, something like that. But they are obvious earthworks that have been reused at different times. Now, the big story that we have here is one that was presented by Professor Andrew Fleming, arising from the work that he did with Tim Lorry in Swaledale, carrying out detailed field recording, looking at documentary evidence, looking at place names, and bringing all of this evidence together to explain a whole area of landscape. And Andrew Fleming put forward this idea that there was a discrete polity, is the word that he ends up using. He can't really decide what to call it. A kingdom, but who knows whether it had a king or a chief or whatever. So he ends up calling it a polity, some sort of socio-political unit at the top end of Swaledale, marked out by largely by topographical boundaries, running along watersheds around the top of the dale there, but persisting into early documentary sources. So he calls this the Kingdom of the Swale, and ties the Grinton-Fremington Dykes into that big story of an early British, post-Roman British kingdom constructing defences across Swaledale against the encroaching Angles, the Anglian settlers and invaders coming from the east, because the ditches are on the eastern side of the banks. And that was, you go back to late 19th century literature and you can find people really going overboard on this idea of the heathen Anglo-Saxons invading from the east and the poor old Brits mounting a stalwart defence that ultimately was fruitless. So is this the big story that we've got in Swaledale? Well, there's been very, very little archaeological investigation up there. The Swaledale and Arkengarthdale Archaeology Group, or SWAG as we refer to them, carried out a very small, limited excavation on the westernmost of the Grinton Dykes there. And, as these things would go, very, very little independent dating evidence. They did manage to find some bits of charcoal, enough for a radiocarbon date, but all that would show is that that western dyke was constructed sometime after 50 BC. Can't say how long after, because of the position in which the charcoal was found. So it's interesting, but not conclusive. As part of their work on the dykes in Swaledale, they commissioned Durham University to do some work on that dyke bottom left, which is on High Harker Hill. It's an interesting one, it's a curious one, because there are two sections to it. It doesn't obviously continue any of the lines of the Grinton-Fremington Dykes. It seems to extend a natural limestone cliff face, a natural crag face, and then you've got the bank and ditch, so on each end of it. Now, the radiocarbon dates from there suggest that that was constructed towards the end of the first millennium, AD. So that doesn't fit in with Angles, it doesn't fit in with ancient Britons, it doesn't fit in with any of those. What on earth is that for? Well, your guess is as good as anybody's. And if you look at those dykes, they don't, apart from perhaps the Grinton-Fremington ones, which are roughly parallel, but discontinuous. The others, there's one down at Marrick to the right, there's one that goes along the contour, They don't form an obviously coherent enclosure comparable, say, to Stanwick or anything like that. And the issue, even with the Grinton-Fremington dykes themselves, is their length, or more realistically, I suppose, where they stop and why they stop. If we follow the grand story of the invading Angles, marching up Swaledale, meeting one of these earthwork boundaries, well, we just go around it. So do they work defensively? It depends. And this is a question of scale. So I think when looking at these sorts of structures, we do need to start off with looking at the scale at which they may have operated. Now, Stanwick, as an enclosed area, is operating on a large scale. It's enclosing several modern villages now, huge area. These structures, did they run between patches of dense, impenetrable woodland that no longer survive? Are they, like Henry V's troops at Agincourt, are they putting their defences between wooded areas that the enemy wouldn't think of trying to get through? Possibly. So the landscape itself may have changed significantly and may have been an integral part of those original features if they were operating defensively. Now we're going to zoom in on that western Grinton Dyke because Andrew Fleming has carried out a very detailed earthwork survey in these parts of Swaledale, covered really some quite impressive amounts of evidence. But this location that you're looking at here was critical to his suggestion that the Grinton Dyke were early medieval and were constructed as part of this ancient British kingdom. Okay, so you're looking at that and you're thinking, well, I can't see a damn thing there. There's really not much to look at. Again, we can turn to LiDAR and we can look at the 50 centimetre resolution LiDAR, which is available for this particular bit of Swaledale. So that means that for every 50 centimetre square, there is a laser-generated height value. And that is pretty remarkable when you think about, as some of you here I know have, when you think about standing out there in the howling gales with the rain lashing down, trying to survey an earthwork over, with a 30-metre tape. This is just wonderful. Because also, it's digital. And with the aid of computer power, we can play around and enhance that digital data. So this is just a technique for enhancing anything that may be on an archaeological scale. And we can take that further. We can do some colouring in. I love colouring in. So this is using multi-directional hill shading from 16 different directions, which is the equivalent of the sun casting a shadow from 16 points of the compass all the way around. So it's showing up banks facing to the west as brown. It's showing up anything facing to the east as blue. And the intensity of the colour is showing the steepness or otherwise of the landscape at that point. And so it's critical. This is a critical location because Andrew Fleming proposed that the earthworks of the Romano-British settlement there were overlain by the bank of the Grinton Dyke, the West Grinton Dyke. Now, that settlement is only dated by analogy. Again, to the best of my knowledge, there has never been any actual archaeological investigation of that settlement. We've no artifacts from it. We've no charcoal for dating from it. But it looks like the hundreds of Romano-British settlements that have been surveyed across the north of England. So if we take that as a Roman period settlement, 1st, 2nd century, maybe into the 3rd century AD, but no earlier, what detailed survey on the ground and analysis with the help of LiDAR by Stuart Ainsworth and Tim Gates and Al Oswald, what that survey showed is that that settlement actually it overlies the earthworks of the bank and ditch. So the bank and ditch were there first. And if that settlement is the Roman period, they have to be pre-Roman and not early medieval. So that's another big story kicked out by a reassessment, a re-evaluation with the advantage of new evidence, of new data. Can we do that anywhere else? Well, there's no big story attached to this one. Well, I'd say no big story. This is Tor Dyke above Kettlewell. We're looking north from the summit of Great Whernside. We're looking up Wharfdale. Andrew Fleming suggested that this earthwork might be another of these boundary earthworks associated with an early medieval kingdom, in this case, the kingdom of Craven. Now, before illustrating that, I just want to give you a bit of geology, really, because one of the quite remarkable things about Tor Dyke is how it fits into the landscape, how it utilises the landscape. And the landscape here is created by the solid bedrock geology. And that has implications above and beyond just the mere siting of this earthwork. So what you're looking at there is to the top right, there's a blue shaded area going up towards the scale. That is limestone, that is the main limestone at the top of the Yoredale series, and the light brown, orangey, yucky, yellowy sort of colours, it comes out on the screen there, to top left and on the right, that is the Grassington grit that is above that limestone. And then coming down towards the bottom of the picture, we've got the Yoredale series rocks of these alternating bands of limestone shales and sandstones with thin beds of coal in amongst them. There is an orangey line along part of the Tor Dyke, and that is a sandstone inlier. So there's quite a complex geology, but the earthworks are intimately associated with how that geology has eroded. The sandstones are more resistant, the limestones are less so. There are softer shales and mudstones which erode away very easily. That gives you this stepped profile, which you can see up Wharfdale. And it creates these sudden drops, these sudden terraces, cliff edges, call them what you will. And in this particular location, where the whole landscape is coming in around the headwaters of these becks, it's creating this almost like an amphitheatre effect, which Tor Dyke runs along the top of. So it is a boundary, it's a present-day administrative boundary at a whole host of different levels. It's a parish boundary, it's a district, or it was a district boundary before Craven was removed, dissolved. It's a parliamentary constituency boundary. It's a very convenient place to draw a line. And it's marked out by these very clear, very big earthworks. So Andrew Fleming suggested Tor Dyke might be part of a definition of the boundary of this kingdom of Craven. I will admit now, we don't have any evidence to support that. So the lack of evidence has allowed that big story to take hold to some extent, along with several others. So there we have the LiDAR image for that area showing Tor Dyke at the top, and also showing two farms in the rectangles there. Now those farms have rather interesting and suggestive names. So we're going to have a very brief digression into history. I know I'm getting broad-minded in my old age, because those farms are East Scale Park and West Scale Park. And in the first edition of the Ordnance Survey maps, there is delineated Scale Park at 489 acres, 2 rods and 10 perches. Now we know from the work of antiquarians that in 1410 a royal licence was granted to Ralph Neville, the Earl of Westmoreland, to build a fortified lodge and enclose 300 acres. Now I've put fortified in inverted commas there because it's not as though Ralph was building a castle. He was building a posh hunting lodge, so posh that he wanted it to be crenellated. And this is referred to as a license to crenellate, which you had to get permission from the king, because in the early days of the medieval period it was all about building castles, but by the time we get to the early 15th century it's just a sign of status and wealth. So Ralph Neville is enclosing this part of Upper Wharfedale, this side part of Upper Wharfedale, for hunting purposes. We do know quite a lot in different parts of the country about the enclosure of land for deer parks and for hunting areas. Earthworks are frequently a part of that. And if we zoom in on the first edition Ordnance Survey map, the 6-inch map, we can see that where their depiction of the boundary of Scale Park turns a corner, the ancient entrenchment, Tor Dyke, the earthworks, peter out. So, hypothesis number 1. The earthworks of Tor Dyke are part of Ralph Neville defining his hunting area around Scale Park. He doesn't want his deer disappearing over the horizon and down Coverdale where somebody else will kill them. So that's hypothesis number 1. Now, if we look at the LiDAR for that same area, we can see a number of surprising things. Yes, we've got the corner of the boundary within that left-hand rectangle. The earthworks do appear to carry on a bit further beyond that, but what we can see most clearly coming up this left-hand side are a series of tracks, quite a network of tracks going up that steep slope, up that steep hillside, right past the end of Tor Dyke. Like the point I made earlier, if you want to attack through one of these things, well, you don't attack it head on, you go around the end. So Tor Dyke here doesn't appear to have a convincing defensive end to it, and it fizzles out where it reaches that corner of the deer park. The little rectangle to the right there shows something that hasn't really been picked up on before in any of the recording of this site. There is a levelled area with what appear to be the remains of some sort of enclosures or structure on it. And that's not marked on the first edition Ordnance Survey map. Moving along Tor Dyke to the west, we've got an area in that long, thin rectangle where if you look on top, you can see, at the top edge, you can see there's a bank running along that top edge, and there are some small enclosures behind it. And then further along to the east, there's another levelled area below that scarp slope, that steep scarp face, where the ditch appears to, either it runs out or it's been infilled and something has been constructed on there. So this is on the inside of Scale Park. It's nothing at all to do with it being a defensive structure, but maybe these are things that were put up there in relatively recent times. Moving across the road further to the east, there is this interesting area where, in actual fact, we have the largest earthworks, the highest, most substantial earthworks of the entire length of this supposed dike structure on either side of that spring. Now, I don't want to criticise the ordnance surveyors and their cartography, but there are some errors, not least of which, those of you who know about hachures will agonise along with me that the hachures appear to be the wrong way round. And what the cartographer is depicting on the southern side of Tor Dyke is not a ditch, but a bank, because the hachures are indicating something that comes up, not something that goes down. You may think that's a slight technical point, but just you wait. Also, as depicted on the map, that spring is just going across those features somehow. In fact, if you can look closely enough at this, the features on the northern side are not shown as a bank at all, they're shown as a terrace. So there are some issues there, but what you can see coming down that right-hand side is a series of enclosures. And these enclosures have got people very excited. So I want to look on the ground at the area within that yellow rectangle, because even on the aerial photographs you can see that there is the ditch, there is the modern stone wall going across, and then there is the bank beyond that. Now the aerial photographs rely on shadows, so in this case anything facing down the picture and being highlighted, so the highlights are the banks and the northern side of the ditch. The shadows are the southern, on the southern side of that stone wall, the shadows are revealing a ditch, not a bank, as indicated by the Ordnance Survey. And there you can see how the LiDAR emphasises those features. And you can see how particularly that big bank to the north of the wall curves round and then just fizzles out. It's like a big tadpole that just fizzles out. It's not part of a continuous structure. And I can't help wondering whether the presence of those significant banks just at that one point where there's a natural funnel coming up, whether that is some kind of routeway, some ancient routeway through there which has been defended, controlled, emphasised by those earthworks, because the ditch along Tor Dyke is on the south side. So the sequence is ditch, steep natural scar slope, on top of which is a little bank, or here, a very big bank. So going back to the principles of how defensive earthworks work, if Tor Dyke was built by anyone, it was built to be defensive. It was built by the people in Coverdale to keep the people in Craven, and not the other way around. So it's seeming less likely to be part of an earthwork boundary defining the Kingdom of Craven. Looking at these enclosures, again, if you take the preconception that anything small and round is a hut circle and therefore prehistoric, you might, as Arthur Raystrick did, term these Brigantian enclosures and decide that Tor Dyke, the whole of Tor Dyke, is an Iron Age Brigantian earthwork. Well, we can enhance those with the LiDAR. Now, Here the LiDAR is only 1 meter resolution, so it's not ideal. But if you cast aside preconceptions about hut circles, you can maybe begin to see that some of those are sub-rectangular, or maybe even actually rectangular in outline. And I'm talking about the little structures within those enclosures. So hypothesis number 2. Are these enclosures not Brigantian, but more like upland sheilings that are found scattered throughout the North Pennines? Could there be any indications to support that particular hypothesis? Well, I stressed the presence of that main limestone behind Tor Dyke, so going over towards Coverdale, because that has created a big, flat, level area of lovely grazing, lovely pasture, in between the steep slopes of Great Whernside and Tormere Top, which are acidic gritstone. Now, we have an argument between the farm at Scale Park and the farm at Coverhead. From the early 1600s, and I'm very grateful to Professor Angus Winchester for sharing his notes on this with me. So we have deponents from Scale Park attesting that for some years 80 head of cattle and about 30 horses were grazed in that area of Hunter's Sleet. And from Scale Park, they also put forth into Hunter's Sleet ewes and lambs to the number of 32 from the middle of April until the last of May following. We've been using it for years, Gov. From Coverhead, we did dog and put forth all goods and cattle of strangers from off the said pasture called Hunter's Sleets. That pasture was dyked and walled from Kettlewell Common, saving one great piece of mossy ground is not dyked or fenced. The tenants of Coverhead hath made said fence. Now, of course, the tenants of Coverhead could have reinforced an ancient bank that was already there, but certainly there has been 17th century, 16th century activity, debate, and incursions onto that piece of valuable upland grazing. Now, I want to end with a real humdinger of a problem. And, you can go away and think about this, because I certainly don't know what's going on. Looking at the first edition Northern Survey map, at that southeastern end, well, I say end, although Tor Dyke has always been seen as ending at this point, and in fact the scheduled area, it's a scheduled ancient monument, the scheduled area finishes at that point. In actual fact, as you will see for yourselves from the LiDAR, in actual fact the ditch continues round and then goes right up the side of Great Whernside, right up the top of Great Whernside, none of which is recorded. But I want to home in finally on this point here. And this is from the scheduling document, more recent mapping. So these are the two areas we've been looking at, and you can see that there is a difference between the first edition depiction at that end of the dike and the more recent mapping. Perhaps that has the advantage of aerial photography to help it. There are, as I've said before, some issues with the first edition mapping, so maybe we can't take that as gospel. But if you look at the LiDAR, and if you go up there and look at it yourselves, there is something very peculiar going on at this point. Not only is it very peculiar, but it seems to be quite a well-defined stony bank that comes up from the lower level, crosses all those administrative boundaries, crosses the township boundary and so on, up to the higher level where those enclosures are. So some years ago, I began a process of reinvestigating Tor Dyke. Unfortunately, it was a process that was brought to a premature end by the closure of the adult education department at Leeds University. So we didn't get on anything like as far as we wanted to get, but we put a trial trench in to examine that particular feature and were completely surprised to find well-constructed wall, but a facing wall behind which was loose material, quite almost like a void behind it, but with layers associated with its structure. Intrigued by that, we had a quick magnetic survey of what appears to be a building or structure or an enclosure down at the lower end of that feature. And that, I mean, it's nothing convincing, but it's certainly a lot more magnetically active than would appear to be by a sort of natural background. And my first thought, and this is where things get really strange, and I apologise, my first thought was to go back down the hill to Kettlewell smelt mill, which you can see here. The end of the flue of Kettlewell smelt mill looks uncannily like what we were dealing with up on Tor Dyke. I'm horrified to confess. Now, Kettlewell smelt mill is an elaborate structure. It began in the 17th century, was embellished. The flue was added in the 19th century. But, you know, there's no mention of anything going on up there in those 17th century documents, those early 17th century documents. And surely if there was something going on across that important administrative boundary at a later period, even perhaps later than the first edition of the Ordnance Survey, surely there would be something in historical records somewhere. I throw that out to the assembled company as a challenge, and thank you for your attention this evening, because that's where I'm going to leave you.